So, what is the perfect fountain pen? Is that even possible? And why take that on as an exercise? Well, I think if you consider each individual aspect of a fountain pen and you refine it down to its most perfect form, it gives you some idea of what it is that you're really looking for in a fountain pen, and helps to unify it with your aesthetic, your ideal of beauty and performance. It'll certainly help prevent you from buying pens that don't serve your needs. So, let's take a little journey together into what makes a perfect fountain pen. Plato considered the existence of a perfect form beyond each object, each idea. If anything could exist, then there was that perfection, and everything that we encountered was merely a reflection of it in all of its different variables and instances. Does that sound familiar in regard to fountain pens? It certainly does for me. So imagine then the noble fountain pen, how sublime in design, how beautifully formed, how exquisite in function. And picture all the different variables, the nibs, the grip, the cap, the filling system, the materials, the colors. So many different aspects go into a fully formed fountain pen. I think a good starting place is to simply imagine a fountain pen. And that image in your mind might be somewhat of a hint toward a perfect form. And I bet it's individual to each of us. What does it look like for you? You see, the thing is, when considering a fountain pen, there are so many different variables to consider, but often we are seduced by shiny materials and really slick marketing or brand affiliations, or even videos posted by influencers and many other factors. I think it's very valuable to just consider what it is that we are looking for at its essence. What works for us aesthetically and practically. Once you consider this, you can build a framework upon which you can imagine which is the exact right, perfect pen for you. One that might perhaps become your signature pen and never leave your side. First, let's consider how this pen interacts with our hand. Its size, dimension, weight, how it presses against our flesh, how it rests against us comfortably, or perhaps there are pointy parts like facets that dig into our hand. This is the sheer physicality of it, but it's often overlooked, and we often adapt our hand to our pen when surely our pens should suit our hands. So before anything else, feel how it interacts with you. Allow the fountain pen to have a conversation with your hand and see where that guides you, which sort of dimension, grip, and everything else suits you. Let's go through it now, more specifically. I think one of the first things you encounter when touching a fountain pen is its weight. And this is very important. Too heavy of a pen can be tiring to steer across the page. You might get to the point where you're dragging your hand and that nib across, and it's a bit of a chore with too heavy of a pen. Now, too light a pen has some other problems. It might feel too light and not quite substantial enough in your hand. Sort of makes it too quick, a little more difficult to rein in. But somewhere between these is sort of a Goldilocks weight. That perfect weight that gives you enough balance and control for your hand. And this is probably a little different for everyone. I think for me, it's somewhere around 25 grams, which also just so happens to be the weight of the Mont Blanc 146. For me, that's my Goldilocks weight. A nice combination of balance and control that allows me to move the pen across the page with ease and gives me a feeling that's substantial enough that I'm holding an instrument and not so light that my hand will simply fly off the page out of control. So for me, this is ideal. Now let's turn our attention to the girth of a pen and specifically on the grip. Too wide of a girth might spread your hand too far, making it a bit difficult to steer to form the sort of letters that you're used to. Too narrow might require a bit more of a pinching grip. So you need to find what is the perfect grip size for you, and this will be very important. Many pens are very slight, and it's very difficult to adapt your hand to something that you're not used to using regularly. For me, that perfection is somewhere around 10 to 12 millimeters across in diameter. This is a perfect size to suit my hands with its needs and its shortfalls to be able to create beautiful handwriting and keep my hand from feeling either cramped or just awkward. But I think this is different for everyone. So it is definitely valuable for you to consider this for yourself. Some fountain pens that have the perfect grip for me include the Mont Blanc 146, the Pilot Custom 823, certainly the TWSBI Eco, the Sailor 1911L, and the Pineider La Grande Bellezza. Those are really sweet pens. My ideal shape for a grip is cylindrical. Now, I know the Lamy Safari has that triangular grip, but it's very polarizing. In fact, I took a poll once, and about 50% of people preferred it, so it's nearly split down the middle. For me, a cylindrical grip is perfect because it allows different angles of attack, different ways to hold it, and should your hand change over time, or should you have any sort of issues with your own grip, you're able to switch it up a little bit. It gives you a little more variety, and I like that. I think we can take the cylindrical concept to the form of the overall pen as well. For me, that's the perfect form for a pen. I do love some faceted pens. I mean, one of my favorites, the Egyptomania, is faceted. But when I think of perfection, it's probably much rounder. And a cylinder, cigar-shaped pen is probably ideal. Just makes it more streamlined and very balanced, very lovely, very pleasing to the eye. And that's important as well as you write with it. A cylinder is also very comfortable. There's no sharp edges or anything else to dig into your hand and to distract you from the task at hand, which is to write and write beautifully. Another important part of the balance of a fountain pen in your hand is its length, and more importantly for me, how it relates to your perlicue, this bit of flesh between your thumb and your first finger. If it presses into it because it's too small, it can be extremely uncomfortable. If it barely passes it, it might be tough to control. So it needs to be far enough beyond it, but not so far that the weight of the back of the pen is causing the nib to rise, and then your hand sort of becomes a fulcrum, a little seesaw, and you're fighting against those physics while you write with your pen. I feel that way if I post a TWSBI, especially a 580. That has so much weight at the back, it's just lifting my nib up. It just feels a little ridiculous. Now you take either a Diamond 580 or an Eco and unpost them, and they're exquisite. They're the perfect length. Or something like a 146 feels very good unposted. Certainly a 149. So there is this perfect balance between length and that weight at the back. Too much, it just throws the whole thing off. Now that we've imagined the weight, the length, and the general shape of our pen, what will we make it out of? Now this is tough. What's the ideal material? And this is really where things get refined, because I would probably exclude all metals but aluminium. So that pushes out things like the bronze and the brass Kaweco Sports. That's a tough choice. But I think to get to an ideal form, you want a material that doesn't feel sweaty in your hand. Something that you can write with at length in comfort, but also doesn't feel in any way distracting. Not too much grain or slipperiness. And I think our choices here are refined down to a really nice resin or a celluloid. Something that's going to feel warm in your hand and not get too slippery. And some of the resins are designed that way, and they feel quite nice. Now, let's consider the humble cap. There's certainly many different styles of caps, but they really come down to two different camps. Some kind of snap cap or quick release cap, and a screw-on cap. Now, screw-on caps are fantastic for keeping your nib nice and wet and ready to go, and some of the snap caps are less effective at this. However, for spirited writing, for your everyday writing, you really need to access your nib quickly. So I think that snap cap is probably the way to go on our perfect pen, but maybe designed such that you don't get that dryness. This puts me in mind of some of the friction caps, like on the Pilot E95S, or even the quick release cap on the Visconti Homo Sapiens. Now let's consider the filling mechanism. And I think that a converter filling mechanism is probably the best, because if there's a problem, it's so easy to just switch out a converter, just buy another one. Certainly easy to access, but there's just something so inelegant about unscrewing your pen and reassembling it every time you fill it. It's just more integrated and elegant and beautiful to use a piston fill. But it has that downside that if there is an issue, you're kind of stuck. Unless you're very good at fixing your own pens, it's off to a repair shop. TWSBI might be the one exception, since it's fairly easy to take those apart and fix them. Nevertheless, we're speaking of perfection here. So what I imagine is a very robust and nearly flawless piston fill system so that it's integrated in with the rest of the pen. Maybe something close to a Visconti Homo Sapiens. That power fill system is exquisite. Imagining the perfect nib is difficult. It would almost be easier to imagine each different type of nib in its perfected form. But if we set that aside and we consider what the perfect nib would be for each of us, I imagine for me, it would be close to a vintage ideal number 2 nib as found on an old vintage Waterman pen. But it would be larger and more decorative, closer to how Montblanc decorates their pens. I'd want it to have a bit of softness, maybe even flex, but more on the downstroke. I wouldn't want it to be a true flex, not for my perfect nib. I think flex pens are amazing and they're fun to use, but they're better as a tool. Perfect nibs for me are more expressive. They have a hint of line variation, but they're not over dramatic. They're much more subtle. So where does that leave me? I have all of these different variables. Is there a perfect pen I can make from this? I can think of some pens that come close. Certainly the Montblanc 146 is very close. Now I have it with a calligraphy nib, but I write often with it without flexing it at all. And it's beautiful. It's smooth. It's expressive. It's fun. It's also an extra fine in that mode, which is very rare for me, but I still love it. Another pen that's close to this would be the Sailor 1911L, although I find its nib to be a bit hard, but its dimensions, just perfect. And it is really smooth. A 21 karat nib is something, and to be honest, that pen doesn't get enough attention or love from me, but it is beautiful. Another one is the Pineider La Grande Bellezza. This is an exquisite pen. It gets sidelined quite a bit in my collection, sort of eclipsed by other pens, but every time I take it out, it's just a joy. And it really comes close with that quill nib on there. It is super soft and just interesting to write with, just very unique. It's not like any other nib I've ever encountered. It's maybe close to the Egyptomania, but it is a thing unto itself. And it even has a cap that's like a snap cap. That's a pretty good choice. I think that's my perfect fountain pen. Maybe the search for perfection should never be realized. Maybe it should never be achieved. Maybe it's just the striving, the obsessing, the consideration, the thinking of all these different aspects. Maybe the path toward perfection yields a wisdom that achieving it never could. So, what do you think of all this? Have you ever considered the perfect fountain pen for yourself? Which pen comes closest? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you've reached this point, please subscribe. I'd love to have you along on this journey with us. We go to some amazing places. And if you want to support this channel even more, consider membership. There's a lot of things going on behind the scenes, and I'd love to see you there. So I make new videos every week, and I have a live show every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. So I can promise you, we will see each other again very soon, further up the road. So take care.